ability for this presentation to be viewed by those inside after the events conclude. The session again will last for roughly an hour, and beyond the introductions that will sort of kick off the beginning of the discussion, I have a slate of prepared questions that I've asked the guests to think about and respond to that will take up a good chunk of the hour, but we will be saving time near the end for each of the panelists to talk with one another, ask questions of one another, and potentially gauge each other as well. And then there will be time at the end for a Q&A. So if you are using the chat function or the Q&A function within Zoom, we will be screening those questions and be happy to present some of those back to the guests as well once the hour concludes. So otherwise, thanks again for being here, and the floor will be largely for the speakers. Let's have them start by introducing themselves. I don't know if anybody wants to volunteer to go first, but have you all say a little bit about your work and what brings you here.
Sure, I can get started. My name is Simon Balto. I'm an assistant professor of history and African American studies at the University of Iowa. I wrote a book that came out 2 years ago called Occupied Territory: Policing Black Chicago from Red Summer to Black Power, that really looked at the ways in which a racially repressive policing regime structured pretty heavily around anti-Blackness developed in Chicago over the course of the 20th century. And I'm working on some new stuff now that includes, it's not solely focused on sort of carceral state and policing issues, but it's heavily informed by those. I'm working on a biography of Fred Hampton, and I'm working on a few other things that sort of intersect with these interests. But yeah, I'm really happy to be here. I think that this is a really important program, and you know, I'm hoping that it can be, you know, empowering and, you know, and useful for a lot of different people, myself included.
I could go next. Hey everyone, I'm Marisol Lebrón. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Texas at Austin in the Department of Mexican American and Latino Studies. So I think, you know, Simon and my books probably came out around the same time, like book twins perhaps. But so I wrote a book also 2019 called Policing Life and Death.
Did Marisol freeze? Uh-oh. Well, I think,
should we wait for her to return or should I go ahead?
Let's have you introduce yourself, DeAnza, and then maybe Marisol will make, there she is. Okay.
Sorry, my Zoom just quit. Can you all hear me? Sorry about that.
Yeah, we got you now.
Okay. You know, the wonders of Texas infrastructure here at work is what we're seeing. So I wrote a book, Policing Life and Death, Race, Violence, and Resistance in Puerto Rico. And in that book, I traced the rise of punitive governance in contemporary Puerto Rico. And so punitive governance, what I mean by that is the ways that policing and other carceral technologies become a means for the state to manage crisis, and also for the state to kind of reinforce ideas of policing, incarceration, and state-sanctioned violence as public goods and as productive. And so in that book, what I try to trace is actually use policing as a lens for understanding contemporary iterations of the colonial relationship between the United States and Puerto Rico, and the ways in which it functions, policing functions in Puerto Rico as a way of understanding race and class. So I'm also working on some new projects. And so the next thing I'm working on is actually a history of how Latinx populations in the United States have encountered police repression and systems from the 1800s to the contemporary moment. So I'm really excited to be working on that.
Hello, everyone, and a huge thank you to Mary and Jess with the National Conference and Alliance for Higher Education in Prison for putting this wonderful event together. My name is DeAnza Cook. I'm a fourth-year PhD candidate at the Harvard History Department, and I have the esteemed pleasure of working with my amazing mentor and primary graduate advisor, Elizabeth Hinton, as well as Evelyn Higginbotham, Walter Johnson, and Chris Winship. I do not yet have the very coveted and long sought after book project, but I am busily working away on my dissertation project on the history of policing in Boston, from the infamous busing crisis in the 1970s to the so-called Boston Miracle in the 1990s, all the way up into the appointment of the first Black police commissioner in the city. And I'm fascinated with understanding the intricacies and development of police reform in our country, and looking forward to contributing to the vast amount of scholarship that's come out in recent years on the power dynamics of liberal law and order, the importance of police science and experimentation in the late 20th century, as well as the role of Black police officers and police partners in the community, from faith-based groups to public health and social service providers. So I'm very excited to be in conversation with all of you and look forward to hearing your questions.
Awesome. Thank you all for those great introductions. My first kind of question for all of you really stems, can be kind of succinctly put as, where are we? If you could just kind of spend some time contextualizing the present moment, whatever that means to you, or however that takes shape in light of your work. Let's begin there.
Simon, go for it. I just saw you unmute yourself.
No,
so go for it.
I don't want to be the man that's speaking first every time.
So no, I'll kind of keep it brief, and I actually want to have kind of, I'm hoping we can have a back and forth kind of about this, because it's something I've been thinking a lot about, I think, in terms of what's been going on over the past year. And I think for a lot of us who identify as, folks who are interested in questions of abolition, and especially thinking through questions of police abolition, this past year in some ways has been really awesome, right? And so I teach a class here at UT Austin, and that I've taught at a number of institutions on the history of policing and Latinos. And it was interesting to teach that class this year after the uprisings of the summer, where, every time I teach that class before this year, it's kind of like slowly introducing questions and themes around abolition. And, so the first day of class this year, we go around and introduce ourselves and say why, folks are interested in the class. And, the majority of students came to that class wanting to learn and think through questions of abolition. So, it feels like there's a major kind of sea change happening in this moment, which has been incredibly heartening. I think there's been a popularization of a lot of the discourse around police abolition and around kind of taking seriously the limits of reform, and it things like seeing Mariame Kaba's book on the New York Times bestseller list, right? I mean, these are incredible kind of watershed moments that, I think even 2 years ago are kind of inconceivable in some ways, that are really heartening for me as an educator, and for me just as a kind of political person interested in these questions. But at the same time, it's been incredibly frustrating with that same kind of attention and popularization of these themes and questions, the ways in which we're seeing, and DeAnza, I'm really interested in your thoughts on this, these kind of liberal attempts to kind of subvert, I think, the radical impetus behind, to kind of push through reform by another name. And so that has been really challenging, right? To take the wins and take the successes, at the same time being incredibly mindful of the ways in which people are really kind of strategically and trying to undermine these movements and these demands that folks are making, right? So the question for me always becomes like, how do we not end up with, you know, body cams as the solution, as we saw like after Ferguson, right? Like whatever the iteration of that is going to kind of be in this post, you know, 2020 moment of, you know, these radical demands being kind of co-opted and these kind of watered down reforms being pushed.
Yeah, just echoing Marisol's point on how dynamics in education around abolition are changing. I'm a teaching fellow for a new course on prison abolition at Harvard College. And for me, the context of where we are now, absolutely, at least historically, requires a look at prison abolition movements and anti-police organizing that's been going on before the 1950s and especially after the 1960s and 70s with groups like Kappa in Los Angeles, the Combahee River Collective in Boston, to critical resistance and so on. And Black Lives Matter and all of these derivative and other localized movements and internationally networked movements are drawing from this history to make arguments about police abolition. And I think that as a result of that, we are really teasing out what a lot of anti-carceral scholars refer to as a difference between non-reformist reforms that actually bring critical transformative change, that actually dismantle structures of oppressive policing and punishment, versus the reformist reforms that Marisol was speaking to, like the body cams, the things that we kind of paper over the existing foundation of what policing and prisons have done, not just to the most marginalized communities, but to our entire society as a whole and the way that we think about policing. And so what gives me hope is that the struggle is ongoing. It's historically informed, and it's intersectional, it's diverse, it's encompassing environmental movements, it's encompassing indigenous movements, it's encompassing Black lives, queer lives, you know, and many other folks who are traditionally left out of the conversation. And I think that's really important and really inspiring. But of course, with that change comes with the inevitable resistance and the inevitable cynicism that comes with proposing radical ideas and new ways of living and relating to one another that really speak against some of the traditions that have been deep-seated and longstanding in policing. So for me, it's trying to figure out, okay, how do we talk about policing in an unequal but yet quote unquote democratic society? What do we even mean when we say police? Is it just changing the structure of departments like the mayor of Ithaca in his recent announcement of creating this department of community solutions and public safety? Is that enough? Is that not far enough? Like, where do we need to go and how do we mobilize people to think about these things collectively? And at least for me, my research on kind of recent developments in police reform and the problems and challenges of not only bipartisan crime control efforts since the federal war on crimes, but also liberal law enforcement efforts in cities like Boston and elsewhere that are seen as more exemplary of things like community policing and stuff like that. Like, people are pushing back on what that actually means and creating not just new language, but new ways of thinking about policing and how it operates in society.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I'm sort of just echoing what my co-panelists have said, but I mean, I think that like this, like we're sort of in an like it's an inflection point, right? About like where is this going? And it's really two very divergent ideas, I think, you know, and I'm really I'm so heartened and inspired by the mobilizations that have, you know, unfolded over the past 10 months, but I mean, 10 months specifically, but really over the past 7 years or so at this point. But, you know, it's been very interesting to sort of watch in real time the ways in which that liberal law and order apparatus that DeAnza is talking about, sort of like to watch it mobilize, like in response to everything that we're trying to say. You know, I mean, so like to think about the fact that at the same moment that activists are rightly calling to, you know, to defund the police and reinvest in community resources, that like the, you know, I mean, the liberal establishment that literally like is living in the White House right now is instead proposing to invest more money into policing as a reform initiative, right? And so it's a really it's a very strange, I think, time to be in right now, where there's so much to be inspired by. There's so much, like, I mean, to Marisol's point, like, there's so much to take away from the fact that, like, Mariame Kaba's, like, explicitly abolitionist book, you know, debuts at #9 on the NY Times top sellers list. Like, people want this information, and, like, it's part of the public discourse. And at the same time, you have a kind of coalition of the center and the center right, and the center, the right, and I think significant sections of the center left that are saying, like, whoa, like, we like, this is too much. Like, we don't want we don't want these sort of radical discourses to be out there. And I suppose that, like, history suggests to us that that's sort of always been the case, right? I mean, like, we can look to previous iterations of these types of demands and think about the ways in which they're treated as, like, complete outliers, radicals, you know, things that you know, no self-respecting American, regardless of their, you know, racial or ethnic identity, should even treat seriously. I mean, like, I've been thinking a lot lately about, you know, about the Panthers and about the Panthers in the late 60s and early 70s, suggesting it, you know, community control of the police, which was also a vision for defunding. It was very much just a call to, you know, for the people to have a say over what policing in their communities looked like, but it was also a call to say, like, in, you know, in the context of Chicago, like, we don't need to be spending $300 million every year on the Chicago Police Department, because they don't keep anybody safe anyway, right? I mean, like, they don't keep, you know, Black communities, brown communities, like, they don't keep any of these communities safe anyway. So, like, why don't we take some of their money and reinvest it into jobs programs, reinvest into schools, and so on and so forth? And, you know, what happens is that those completely legitimate claims of a half century ago are completely shunted to the side and treated as radical. And perhaps they are radical, I suppose, because they break with the status quo in the mainstream, but they're treated as fundamentally illegitimate when they actually do constitute very legitimate challenges and new visions for what, you know, what we should be imagining when we're thinking about, you know, public safety. And that the final thing that I would just say about this too is that the thing that I'm struck by when we think about this particular moment is, you know, we're always having these conversations about policing, right? And, like, the you know, this panel is the history of policing, and for good cause. But, like, I want to have more conversations about public safety and collective good, because these are completely different things. And, you know, most people don't really think about them as distinct, but, like, we need to decouple our understandings of public safety and collective good on the one hand from policing on the other, because policing is not an effective mechanism for ensuring the public good. It's not an effective instrument for ensuring community safety. And so, like, you know, so I'm really struck by, you know, both the sort of pushback against these, you know, the demands that so many folks are making right now, including, you know, a lot of us that are on this call. You know, I'm struck by the pushback against these very legitimate criticisms of the system as it exists, but I'm also struck even further by the fact that, you know, there's a sort of large scale lack of imagination when it comes to imagining a world in which we don't have to think about, we don't have to hear the word police and instinctively think about public safety, right? Because so many people are primed to think in that way, and I think we need to try to break out of that mold.
It's interesting to hear, as all of you are responding to this question, you know, there's various kind of periodizations and period frames for these discussions. There's the recent year, of course, and I think that makes a lot of sense. The Black Lives Matter movement back to several years to Ferguson, Missouri, where I'm speaking, you know, close to tonight. The Black Panther movement in the 60s, the kind of post-1945 neoliberal context. And it's like all of you are drawn into this kind of widening frame over time. And I'm wondering, maybe to Simon's point about this notion of common good, has the kind of position on policing or the thinking about policing and this kind of the moment we're in being driven very much by these present concerns, is there a place we can turn to the kind of deeper sweep of US history, or maybe even beyond US history, appreciate that? Is there work in those directions? Are there conversations in that direction? Or are there places you can see in the work that maybe we could think about this more historically?
Yeah, I'll just take this opportunity to pub something that I was recently working on with my advisor, where we try to situate kind of a long punitive tradition in criminal justice, particularly against Black Americans, but how that really serves as the canary in the coal mine for lots of other intersectional struggles as well. And we do go back to the era of slavery. We talk about, well, I should start first. We talk about kind of how this impetus to extend the timeline comes specifically from activists who are on the ground theorizing about what policing is and how to decouple it from public safety in the ways that Simon's speaking to. And and a lot of them rely on going back to the original functions of police forces in our country, from the era of slavery and settler colonization to the emergence of what we now think of when we hear modern police agencies and the bureaucracies that they function through today. And so I think it is important to understand that policing, the agencies that we know today themselves were a reform measure, that we didn't always have policing, even in patrol cars, even in uniforms, and even armed, right? So there are all these things when people say, oh, disarming the police is so radical, or abolishing and defunding aspects of policing is going to be so detrimental. It's ahistorical, actually, because there are so many moments we can point to on the local level, state level, and international and national levels where police departments have been reorganized by leadership. Their administrations have been completely revamped with new ideas, new technologies. We've gotten more diverse police officers in the last 50 years. And so even the personnel and the types of special units they're involved in have changed extensively. And so undoing a lot of this work and re-examining the intricacies of policing, to me, is really important for getting to those questions of where is the slippage between public safety and common good and punitive policing and predatory carceral practices. How do the language and the discourse that we use around public safety, how does it prevent us from understanding the long-standing legacy of violence that is embedded in what police officers are asked to do and empowered to do in our communities? That history can definitely teach us a lot about the founding of our nation, the values that were and were not incorporated in police departments when they were first chartered, as well as the ways in which that Black people and people on the ground have actively contested some of the reform movements of the past, and how that can serve as a foundation for coming up with new ways in our current moment to do the same thing.
Yeah, I don't feel like I have a whole lot to add to that, because I think it's such an awesome job of, I think, answering that question. But I think there's this great these great lines that folks like Miriam Kaba and Dan Berger and David Stein have, where they're like, if you're an abolitionist, you're a historian, right? And it's so much of what it means to actually be thinking about the future is to actually revisit the past as a way to think strategically about what's worked, what's failed, these conjunctures where we see this struggle to kind of reinstitute a hegemonic order in the face of radical demands and transformation, right? I think we have to think about it in that way, right? That in order to really make the kinds of transformations that we're talking about in terms of both, the actual structure of policing, but I think to Simon's point, right, to the internalized logics that we have around policing that link policing with public safety and good, it takes that kind of long historical view in order to do that. And I think, to DeAnza's point, like when we take that long historical view, what we see is how that suturing of those ideas of public good and safety are linked to things like settler colonialism, to practices of enslavement, to overseas expansion, right? We see the ways in which the public good becomes synonymous with this kind of white settler logic and its protection, right? And so this is something that I've actually been thinking about a lot right now, because I'm doing a ton of readings on the establishment of the border and the kind of establishment of the policing regimes along the border after the kind of US-Mexico War. And that we see that in the lead up to both the establishment of the border, but also the kinds of policing that emerge, right, is about protecting white people from and protecting an order of white supremacist capitalist extraction in the borderlands areas from both indigenous populations, but also Mexicans that were they were there, right, already. And so this kind of notion of policing as this kind of racially neutral or just kind of simple public good, right, functions to occlude that entire history of how we can think about in local and national context, the work that policing does is to reinforce that order, to reinforce a specific racial positioning, right, to facilitate settler expansion and dispossession, to enforce a kind of capitalist extraction at specific moments, right? That's what gets lost when we just don't look back at history and just kind of take it as that kind of public good comment at face value.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I've been sort of beating this horse for months now when I've been asked to give talks, but like I can't get over the fact that people just assume that like United States cities have always had police because it's just, I mean, to DeAnza's point, that's an ahistorical assumption, right? And like there's a particular, I mean, this gets precisely to Marisol's point about like how they're implemented for very particular reasons, and those, generally speaking, don't have much to do with a generic public safety, right? I mean, that they have a specific impetus. The specific impetus for the implementation of police forces is usually some sort of protection / reinforcement of racial hierarchy, of ethnic hierarchy, or of class hierarchy. And so like when we think about the fact that in the United States in 2021, the fact that the police, generally speaking, what they do more than anything is uphold racial, ethnic, and class hierarchies, it sort of makes sense because that's, generally speaking, what they've done from the very beginning. But I was actually struck, like I want to come back to something if I can, and Jesse, I apologize because I know you're the moderator, but I'm just like I'm having a bunch of synapses.
Go for it.
Flashing right now. So I actually, Marisol, if I could come back to this point about how police are not particularly adept at like the sort of tension between police and the quote unquote public good. I'm currently revisiting your book for a piece that Max Felker-Cantor and I are writing about sort of a long history of policing in the United States. And part of the charge for he and I that we were tasked with was writing an encyclopedia entry on the history of crime and policing in the United States. And part of what we're trying to argue is that like this is a very difficult encyclopedia entry to write because those two things are very distinct histories, and like it's very like you can't really tell those two side by side because like the history of crime and the history of policing are like the one does not really inform the other. And I was really struck when I was going back and looking through Policing Life and Death, by the history that you're telling in Puerto Rico in the 90s about how about Puerto Rico's about how the police's efforts to control drug markets essentially just made life worse for so many people. And I thought that would perhaps be useful for people to hear more about if you're willing to entertain me on that.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I'm so excited to hear that you and Max are writing that because that sounds amazing, and I want to sign it and read it, and it's very exciting. But yeah, I mean, I think, Simon, you were making this point yourself, right? Is that like the least of what police do is like fight crime or keep anyone safe, right? The majority of what they're doing is enforcing social hierarchies and facilitating kind of, capitalist order in many ways, right? And so that's definitely what I try to track in my own work, is really thinking through, like, the majority of people feel like, what I try to do in the book is take seriously the fact that people feel really unsafe, right? And so the period I'm looking at is really late 20th century, so like 1980s to the contemporary moment. And people are feeling really unsafe because there is a very volatile kind of informal drug economy that's at work. There's a lot of kind of interpersonal kind of street crime, and things like that, where people are safe and they're looking for kind of solutions. And the government is like, we are going to put thousands and thousands and thousands of police on the street, right? So Puerto Rico is an island of like less than 4 million people, or archipelago of less than 4 million people, and it has the second largest police force under US jurisdiction, right behind New York City, right? And so this question becomes, why does this small place that has this a crime problem, but not particularly, not among the worst, right? Why does it warrant this kind of intensification of policing? And the thing that I look at is like, people felt unsafe, and the only thing the government was willing to kind of offer was more police, right? Because part of what's happening is there's not a discussion about changing colonialism, right? And the colonial order that causes people to feel unsafe, that causes people to turn to the informal economy, that displaces people, all of those kind of root causes of the kind of social crisis that people are trying to navigate in their everyday lives, right, goes unaddressed. And so the police come in essentially to manage that and to allow a kind of colonial order to continue. And I think that, there's a way in which we could say what's happening in Puerto Rico is very unique because of its colonial status, but you talk to anyone in New York, Baltimore, Chicago, Kenosha, right? It's the same story, right? And so for me, that kind of realization helps us to think about policing, and Simon, I think your work is really good at, we have to think about the local, we have to think about policing in a multi-scalar way, right? We have to think about the local, we have to think about the national context, and we need to think globally, right? And the ways in which these are all interacting together to shape the very kind of real interactions that people are having on a day-to-day basis that are at the block level, right, or at the kind of neighborhood level, are influenced by these kind of larger factors. But one of the things I wanted to say too is, I think the question for us becomes like, around periodization, like for me as someone who tries to study the history of policing, right, I want to go really far back. And I think that there is a hesitancy among a lot of folks to go super far back, right? And I think that there's this kind of fetishizing of like the 1960s as this kind of explanation for what we're encountering now. And for me, one of the things I would say is I think we need to keep pushing that timeline back. And so I'm reading Kelly Lytle Hernandez, revisiting that book, Kelly Lytle Hernandez's book, City of Inmates, right? And I love that book because I think it gets us to think about what's happening at the establishment of Western settlements, of these various moments of expansion within the United States that actually help us to think about how do we know what the police are and what they actually do in people's lives. And reading that book helps, like, made me think of this other book which I love and is never, like, people hardly engage it, which is Lana Ross's book Inventing the Savage. And that book is so underrated in terms of helping us to really, yes, I love that book, but to help us think, Simon, this question around like, what's the difference between the history of crime and the history of policing, right? And Inventing the Savage shows us a history of crime that is deeply and intimately connected to the dispossession and attempts to eradicate Native people in this country, right? And the ways in which criminalization processes assisted that, right? policing comes along much after that, right? In order to like reinforce those practices of criminalization, right? And so I think that these are the kinds of cleavages that we need to be attuned to, right? And in very real ways, and to not be scared to kind of take those deep historical dives, right? And really engage in these moments that are, you know, pre-carceral state or whatever, right?
Yeah, thanks everybody. Yeah, and as I'm listening to the comments too, I was thinking about a moment in Simon's introduction to his book where he's saying, I'm basically of two minds about the future, right? I'm torn in two directions. And all of you kind of echoed that point tonight about this question of like where we are, where we're going, what kind of future do we want to see? And so let's open that up and spend a little bit of a couple minutes kind of exploring that, and just in terms of how does your work help you envision and maybe build the world you would like to see?
That's such an important and huge question. And of course, my work is still developing, but one thing that kind of immediately comes to mind is I'm really trying to take seriously the problem and pervasiveness of violence. Obviously, you know, police violence, but also just the real fear of violence and the violence that actually happens in communities of color, because that's real. And it is one of the many reasons why people do couple policing with public safety, why the mythologies about policing are so salient. And we have to continuously try to re-educate and use more tools of political education to get people to think more critically about the role of the police. My work focusing on at least nominally liberal city and focusing in the post-civil rights era is an attempt to try to give us more clarity on some of the more recent developments in police reform and the ways in which that Black law and order movements have influenced the directions that police departments have taken on a local level, as well as influenced the national programs that we push in the form of models that don't just affect major cities like New York and Los Angeles, but smaller cities that have smaller police departments and that are located across the South and Southwest and even beyond US borders, as Marisol's book does. And so I think being able to look at police violence and how it is structured into recent developments in counterinsurgency against gangs, drugs, terrorism, whatever the crisis of the day is. But still reckoning with the fact that a lot of that mobilization, a lot of that support from working middle class, and of course the elites who control the powers and purse strings, I should also add, comes from the reality that people experience interpersonal harms that are compounded by systemic harms each and every day. And we can't just say policing is bad or policing has always been bad. We have to say why. We have to show how. And I hope that my work will be able to do that, because while I respect the title of activist far too much to claim it myself, my work is deeply informed and inspired by the arguments and analysis and critical questions that they ask about policing. And as a police historian, I hope that shedding light on those dynamics will at least contribute a little bit to broader conversations about what we want policing to mean and to look like in future iterations.
That's a tough act to follow. I would say that I mean I would echo to a lot of what DeAnza is saying, in that, like, we need to not lose sight of the fact that, like, there, like, in addition to the fact that, like, police violence and harassment and abuse disproportionately affects communities of color in the United States, so does like real and meaningful harm. And so we need to figure that out about, like, how we proceed to sort of resolve that, how to solve that issue. But, like, I again come back to the fact that, like, policing has proven itself over and over and over again to not be the way that we do that. Like, these are, like, these are statistics that I find really depressing, but I think that they're really enlightening and that people should be aware of when we think about violent harm in the U.S. I mean, so again, to think about Chicago, like in 2019, I haven't seen 2020 statistics yet, but in 2019, in instances of first-degree homicide, the Chicago Police Department made an arrest in 21 or 22% of cases. Over the past decade, they've made an arrest in between 10 and 20% of instances of sexual assault. And like, you can sort of just, I would hope sort of get the point that I'm going for, which is that if we are thinking about an institution, that if we are charging them and assuming that they can reduce and prevent harm, and if we are thinking about things like homicide and sexual assault as being some of the most, egregious forms of harm that a person can commit against another, like the Chicago Police Department having an arrest rate in first-degree homicides that is sub 25%, an arrest rate in sexual assault charges that is somewhere between 10 and 20%, like it's not an effective form of resolving or preventing harm. It just doesn't do what people think that it does. And so if we're gonna like come at this from that, with that knowledge, with the knowledge that this is not an effective institution in terms of actually like preventing harm, which is again what we should be looking for. We shouldn't be looking for more policing. We should be looking for better forms of harm prevention. So if we know that they are not good at harm prevention, then what is the problem with asking ourselves, well, why don't we do something else with the $2 billion with a B dollars that Chicago spends every single year on its police force, right? And so, like it's not necessarily to say that that comes directly from my work, but like my work led me in a lot of ways to understanding the sort of futility of treating this as a small problem that can be addressed with small solutions, right? And I would also say, and again, this comes back to I think what DeAnza was saying in terms of not wanting to claim the mantle of activist, but being heavily informed by the work of activists in terms of the work. I mean, that very much is the position that I find myself in as well. I was actually I was in conversation at Barnard College in October of 2019 with Miriam Kaba, and I told her on the stage, I was like, if I would have had a few more years of political education by reading the works of Miriam, by reading the works of Ruthie Gilmore, by reading the works of so many other really critical abolitionist thinkers who I was engaged with, but not to the extent that I should have been by the time I wrote the epilogue to my book. Like I told Miriam on stage, I was like, my epilogue's kind of wishy-washy. Like I don't think it went far enough in terms of actually thinking about the questions we really need to ask. And so I think it's important to also very much understand that although like the three of us as historians are up here, like, with a lot of, I think, important insights and knowledge to convey, I also think it's very important for people to be thinking about the fact that like we all are deeply, deeply, deeply informed as scholars by the work that organizers and activists are doing. And I have a lot more to say about that, but I'll stop it there.
Yeah, I think, on this theme, I agree. I think that for me at least, and I think I agree with Simon and DeAnza on this, like I try to take the lead of activists, right? I think those are the folks that actually have the most kind of cutting edge analyses, right? That we need to actually be paying the most attention to, right? And so, I think about this question of like what the future would look like, right? I think particularly around this question, Simon, that you're posing around what does harm prevention actually look like and how do we get there? And I think to this example that I talk about in my book, which is I look at this organization, Taller Salud, which is a feminist public health organization, and they had this pilot program based on ceasefire in Chicago that they kind of, you know, take and adapt to the situation in Loíza, which is a predominantly low-income Afro-Puerto Rican community in Puerto Rico, and you know, they had this kind of epidemic of you know, gang violence among young men in the community. That was it felt to residents as if it was unceasing, right? And the police would come in and they would make the problem worse, right? So they would either come in, and because it was a low-income Black community, they would come in with racial epithets and violence and degradation and things like that, and then leave, right, without addressing anything. Or it would intensify the violence in certain ways, right? And so if you ask the police what was causing territorial gang violence among the young men in Loíza, they would tell you it was drugs, right? If you ask residents what's causing the problem, they're like, drugs is the least of it, right? That it was actually things like contests around masculinity between the men, right? Around proving themselves to each other, right? These things that the police are, to them, the problem is always drugs, right? And so when Taller Salud runs this pilot program, they actually talk to the young men, they actually talk to people in the community, and they're able to figure out what we actually need to be doing with these young men is doing workshops with them to get them to think about themselves differently in relation to masculinity, right? To decouple violence from masculinity, to try to create other modes of self-affirmation for them, right? To kind of try to address those issues, because that was actually what was driving a lot of the violence, not all of it by any means, but it was a significant enough factor that through these kind of mediations that they were doing, through these workshops they were doing, they were able to decrease homicides in that area by 50% in the first year of that pilot program, right? And so, you know, what I take from that is one, we have to take risk, right? And I think this question, right, like where you're like, people are dying, right, from violence, right, from interpersonal violence, and when you're in that sense of urgency of confronting kind of bodily harm, right, there's a hesitancy to take a risk and say like, what we don't need is police, and we actually just need to have these conversations around how do young men imagine themselves and then as a result relate to one another, right? That feels really risky because that's slow work. That's work that takes a long time to show results, and in the face of bodily harm, it can be hard to feel like you have the time to do that, right? To do that kind of root cause work. But sometimes that's what actually needs to happen, right? And so like, how do you balance the urgency of reducing harm with a realization that there are deeper, longer issues that need to be addressed? The other thing I take from that example is, you know, the lesson from that for me is also like, when you ask communities what is causing the problems of harm that they're facing, they know, right? You don't need the police to come in and try to that the real problem is drugs or the real problem is this, and not contribute to anything, right? So if you actually ask communities what the problem is and then give them the resources to address that problem, they're perfectly capable of addressing and reducing harm, right, in meaningful ways that isn't this one size fits all model of punitive policing, right? That's like, let's just implement broken windows from, you know, here to Singapore and hope for the best, right? So I think for me, those are the lessons that I take, which is like, the best thing we can do is like get out of the way sometimes, right? And just like listen to what people are doing and amplify that, right? And take those lessons and try to amplify that, which is like the lesson for me is like actually giving people the space and the resources they need to address these issues.
Sorry, and I would just add real quick on that, because I was thinking about like this issue of the future that we want, and like it's in some cases it's already being built, right? I mean, like I know that the narrative about, you know, like the defund movement, the abolitionist movement, has basically been that it hasn't really, like, other than some rhetorical victories, it hasn't really accomplished much over the past, you know, 10 months or whatever. But there's a report that I'll drop in the chat for people from the research team, Interrupting Criminalization, of which Miriam Kaba is a part. But you know, like this process of defunding the police is taking place. It's happening. It's happening really imperfectly and with wildly uneven you know, effects, mostly because it's not being followed through in the sense of, like, we don't just mean defund the police, we mean take those resources and redirect them elsewhere. But you know, when we say, and that's what we mean when we say defund the police, we mean like defund and reinvest those resources totally. But what the research team at Interrupting Criminalization has found, and this is already kind of an outdated report, I suspect these numbers are even higher, is that somewhere between $800 and $850 million over the span of the first 6 months since defund the police first became a clarion call in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder, you know, somewhere between $800 and $850 million has been defunded from local police departments. You know, the sad and telling thing is that less than 200 million of that was reinvested, right? I mean, so it's like that's what that's where sort of the rubber meets the road in terms of what comes next, is like getting local governments to not just say, oh, this is a budget saving measure, but rather this is a measure that we are going to use to meaningfully like redirect resources into, you know, into all sorts of other things that are part of the collective good. But so, you know, I think it's important for people to not just think that like all of the, you know, all of the work out in the streets, all of the calls for defunding over the past, you know, 10 months at this point, like, I think it's important for people to not just think that none of that resulted in anything, because I think that's the narrative that we're being given. But so when we're thinking about the future, I think it's worth understanding that close to $1 billion has been defunded from local police departments in direct response to the calls to do so.
I think we've slightly gone a little bit over time, so I do want to angle us toward a conclusion here in the next few minutes. We didn't have a chance for you all to ask questions of one another necessarily, but we had a little bit of a give and take in some of the conversations. But is there a question that one of you would like to raise for another on the panel? Or any concluding thoughts at this point?
I don't know if I have like a question for my fellow panelists, but I do just want to say that I am incredibly honored to be on this panel and in conversation with you all, and I'm really looking forward, I think, to the work that you all are doing, and DeAnza, especially your project, I think is really vital and exciting. So that's all I have to say.
Yeah, I mean, I'll sort of echo that. I mean, I'm grateful for the work that the Alliance is doing, and this is a real pleasure to be part of this conversation. And I do, again, I mean, I said this before, I really, like, if there's one thing that I want people to come away from these like histories of policing panels to be thinking about, and this is something that I'm just sort of realizing recently, is like, I want people to be thinking about what we mean when we say policing, and if what we mean by policing is public safety. And I think that that's a really important thing to be thinking about, because the one is not the same as the other. And so, like, I don't want to live in a society that's policed. I want to live in a society that is as free of harm as we can make it. And we know that policing does not provide that society.
Yes, I'm just really honored again to be in conversation with all of you and to have so many amazing role models and scholars who've gone before me. I wouldn't be here and where I'm at now with my scholarship and the work that I'm doing if it wasn't for the great work that comes before me. And so I just think that, you know, at least for me, getting folks to see that policing has a history, that it's very, very robust, very, very complicated and entangled with a lot of other problems that we're facing today, but that the struggle is historical, it's ongoing, and we will continue to witness the fruits of the labors that have been planted since the beginning of this nation. And so I hope that we continue to hold on to that hope and work together for the transformations that we want to see. So thank you.
Thank you. I think that's a lovely place to conclude and wrap up. So I just want to say thanks to all of you for taking the time and making the effort to be here and to be in this. This is a tremendously rich and I think far-ranging discussion that I'm sure will inspire a lot of conversations moving forward. So we feel very lucky on this end as well. Have a great night, everybody. We'll see you soon.
See y'all.